Thank you so much.
Great. Right, thanks everyone. Very happy to be here, and I got the post-lunchtime slot, so we need to keep the energy. But very happy to be here, and what a follow-up from all the amazing speakers earlier on. So I really hope that today, I'm trying to, I'll look this way. So for today's session, we'll speak about maps. So how many of you use the map getting here? Let's see, maybe some of you are like, you're amazing. So for the next 15 minutes, I'll speak to you about open mapping and a bit about open mapping in humanitarian context. And then I'll tell you about one AI application. So I actually reference a lot of the principles that we heard at the beginning and how that applies to something that we are focusing on, specifically in disaster response in the humanitarian context. Some use cases, so kind of putting things in practice, and then hopefully plenty of time for questions from some of you. So as you can see, thank you, Huete, for introducing me already. But what I wanted to say is that I'm not an AI specialist, right? And I work in tech. I've been working within the tech for good, in the international development humanitarian space for quite some time. And I often am described as the bridge between the developers and the users. So I say that in the context of, that AI and the relevance to AI is for all of us. And, I'm giving this presentation of not being the expert, and I think that's actually even an important lens to kind of come into. Because I'll be speaking to you about mapping for the next 10 minutes, I wanted to tell you a bit about the organization that I work for, so the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team. As you can see the slide, we're focusing on humanitarian action and community development from open mapping. What does that mean is that we're focusing on the local, and I'll reference that when I'm speaking about reference to AI. Community source data is utilized. So this data is used when decisions are made. So I asked you all about maps, but how many of you have heard about OpenStreetMap? Maybe a few of you. Amazing, great. So that's what I wanted to start, because I'll be referencing maps, and it's interesting. Even in the previous talk, we heard about geolocation and maps, so and the relevance to them. So what OpenStreetMap is, for those of you who maybe first time hearing, which is great, is basically a crowdsourced platform. So it's a bit like the Wikipedia of Maps, and in a lot of parts, I think also relating to your jobs, in a lot of contexts, there are simply no maps available. And OpenStreetMap is a crowdsourced database that is actually allowing the generation of those maps. So we focus specifically on 4 regions, as you can see on this map. So Asia Pacific, Eastern, Southern Africa, Western, Northern Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And the big focus is on filling in that gap in map data, which is used in disaster response, humanitarian action, and so forth. And as an organization, the one thing I wanted to mention, I know some of the ex-member organizations we partner with, is we're around 70 people, all fully remote. That's why I was saying it's nice to see people in person. It's been very nice to be here today. But all the kind of mapping activities and everything that happens is in collaboration with different organizations, different partners, all together. Why I put values at the very start of the presentation is in connection with thinking about AI application in any context. And, there's a bit of text maybe at the back you won't be able to see already, but thinking about putting people first. So even when we're thinking in the mapping context, working in the open, we've picked a bit about the open source and open applications and accessibility for those, being able to collaborate. And what I mean by building for inclusivity, I'll speak in a second when I talk to you about the specific application. So I picked up a bit about maps and open geospatial data. So you hear about geospatial data, and the biggest focus of it is having information that's locally generated and having the tools that allow people to generate those maps and then use them specifically in decision making and humanitarian context. So 3 steps when I move in the second one to talk to you about localized AI and where it has a specific application. So when we talk about maps and how they're generated, when we talk about crowdsourced map, is those 3 simple steps. So the first one is you need imagery. And I think in some of the previous presentation we talked, I think from the BBC one, about imagery. It's your first step before you're able to generate data. And in that second step, you basically currently do everything manually. So, and I would mention briefly one of the current tools we are using for that. So in the second mapping step, you look at that imagery, and imagery normally comes from like satellite or from drone imagery. So it's either satellite imagery or sometimes it's locally generated as well. So in that second step, you manually normally draw, you look at that imagery and you draw and say this is a building, this is a road, in order to navigate to a certain place. And the next stage is where you add the local knowledge directly. So at the moment, where does AI come into that specific space? So at the moment you have manual. So with one of the tools that we are using, you have nearly 500,000 volunteers that currently look at this imagery and add this information to the map by manually looking at the imagery, drawing these buildings, uploading them, and then this information is being used in specifically post-earthquake and disaster response, but also in anticipatory climate action. So at the moment, this is the process with crowdsourced generated data. And what we looked at is, how is this data, how can this process be improved? And all the people who are currently volunteering and adding the information in using AI. And I think the examples that you heard a lot in the morning was about generative AI. And there are different types of AI in which you can apply it to your application. And this specific one is looking at machine learning. So using computer vision techniques to support that process. So it's a slightly different application to we hear all about generative AI, but I think it's important when we speak about AI that there are also other applications. And in this case, it's called computer vision techniques. So what is FAIR? And you hear the abbreviation. And what's the core principles that we focused on in applying AI in that process, in the mapping process? So F for freedom, you can see in there free and open source and the openness in being able to use the technology, AI, and then R is for the responsibility to our communities that we serve. This is the slide that I really wanted to focus on, is the why. So I think with any organization, when we're thinking of, okay, how do we apply AI? Like, where does it really add value? There's so many different options that are available in this context. I'm talking about mapping and map data that's used in disaster response. So when we focus this, it's addressing those 4 bubbles, these 4 problems that you can that you can models that are used are trained on like global data sets. In the context of mapping, they're trained on buildings, for instance, in mainly in the West, Europe, and North America. And if you try to apply that AI application and that model into a small village in Malawi or into another area, it's simply not going to work. So one of the kind of key components of developing and using AI is also focusing on the local context. So moving away from that by localizing that specific model specifically in relation to mapping. Again, we mentioned that, I think the other speakers, a lot of keeping people in every step of that mapping experience in the loop. What do I mean by this? So if we're mapping in East Africa, I wouldn't have knowledge of if this specific square, if that specific if this is a building, or if this how it's connecting to the road. So keeping people with the local knowledge is actually really critical in creating the in using AI. And the last part is building the knowledge. So sometimes you develop an AI application and here we go, use it. But it's actually in developing the service, whether it's a tool, is including people at the very early stages of how it's working before you even test it. So those are the core principles of the AI application that we focused on in supporting the mapping process. How it works, I'll try not to go into too much detail here and focus more on the examples, but it's basically supporting local communities. So it's fully open, and it's creating these localized models that are focusing on one area with the feedback from people in that area, and then it's being applied to a different in a different area, and you can see there are different number of models that are generated there. You can see, again, anyone can log in. There's some example here from, I mentioned the regions that we're focusing on. So the specific model and the training data is generated in a local area, and then it's being reapplied. And again, a few maps that you'll see on the slides as I present in here. And this is what I wanted to say with the openness of those key principles of the training data set. So in order to improve, in this case, again, the context is mapping, but often the training data, and even in other AI applications that we spoke about in the morning, it's not, when we say global, it's mainly focusing on Europe or from the US, and that's not applicable if you're using these models into the context where we're working in and we want to improve that. So a big component of that is also when we think about training data, which I think is not referenced so often. We talk about AI and we're not really focusing on what the model is being trained on and giving the results. So that's another component that is open. And this is, again, you see a lot of buildings, but when I meant that part about humans in the loop, right? So you're not just getting, oh, this is my prediction of the purple, for instance, squares. That in the examples is basically you have people with the local knowledge that can give the feedback and improve the model. So you have the local feedback, and this is what we mean by when I mention the kind of training component of AI. And a few examples, just to kind of put that into context, because mapping is my daily life. I think for you, you're probably a user of the maps, and this is giving you a bit of an insight of how those maps are created. So again, like FAIR, it's a service. You can also take a look at it. But a big part in this last bubble that I presented, which talked about the capacity building. So here I've shared a few photos for some of the trainings that we are doing with OpenStreetMap communities in Kenya, it's at the bottom, and then also in Brazil. So before launching it and fully using it to support those mappers, it's around having the training opportunities involving people at the very early on in improving the AI application. Another map, another satellite imagery that you can see in here. Again, one example when I mentioned that global data sets are not applicable into local context, and this is a specific example in a project happening in Sierra Leone, which is specifically about mapping informal settlements. So if you're trying to, and those areas are often not on the map at all. Right? And you can do the manual mapping, which takes much longer. So with including the AI and the computer vision techniques and being able to generate that map, This is an example where we've partnered with Slum Dwellers International. So as I mentioned, working with local organizations who do have the knowledge to be able to look at the imagery and then use AI to detect these buildings and then have the knowledge of what's, accept or reject and be able to generate. And then again, this presentation is more on the AI element, but adding the additional local knowledge that is then being used for decision making. So in this specific context, it's about household survey data that was also used by their local council in terms of, I think, infrastructure, disability access, specifically in that part. And this is another slide just to talk about this kind of hyper-localized. So when we are looking at AI applications with a specific, not just the global data set, but if that data is trained on a capital city, supporting the mapping process in, as I said, informal settlements on small areas, it's much harder to do that. So creating local model in an area that's then reused in that same area with the same community is what we're focusing. So there'll be different models. So it's not just one, but focusing on the different areas. I think it's quite critical, and that's done with people living in those areas and generating open knowledge. So I think that's kind of the last thing that I also wanted to pick up on is what next. So this is one application of AI in humanitarian context that is not generating new information, is supporting local communities that are already creating maps and generating maps and supporting them through a localized approach with creating the data. And there are two types. Obviously, it's the local mappers. There are also developers living in those countries that can also add different models. And the last part that I wanted to mention is also when we talk about inclusivity, with AI, even just saying models and all these areas, for some people who are not mappers, it might be like, what does that mean? Maybe you have questions on that. But it's also thinking of other applications when people can be involved in the mapping process. For instance, there's an application called Map Swipe where you just, you look at an image and you can swipe left or right to see if there is an image there. So in the context of AI, lowering the barrier by using such applications where people can look at the AI prediction, for instance, and be able to not have to do anything more complex than just looking at an image and being able to say okay, does that look correct or not? And I think that's where I wanted to end. I wanted to do something a bit more practical, but I'd rather maybe have some questions from everyone. Thank you. This is the last slide I missed, which is about the people and some of the AI engineers, working on that specifically. But I always think when we speak about AI, and it's who are the people developing, We can speak about also AI in the context of, code generation. That's another application. But thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting, and to see how you can involve a community where you used to have to buy the map and to open. But question mark. You spoke about the over application in terms of coordination, about standards. You have lots of different applications. Charities are producing their whole map. The UN, governments. How is there any international standard coordination where this map can be shared, coordinated, or how does it work? Because it's quite difficult to choose sometimes one model or one style of application.
of which map to choose to use for your application. This would be the answer with like, it depends of what purpose you need it for. So I think it's the comparison of if you're requiring a map for a specific context, and if you compare maybe Google Maps with OpenStreetMap, in that area, there might not be a lot of data in Google Maps, but a lot more in OpenStreetMap. There are initiatives of trying to combine, like look at, you have Apple Maps, Google, TomTom, and others. That's called like Overture. So they're looking at the different maps and the different data set, but making the decision of which map or which source to use, I think depends on the area or which part you're looking at. And again, I would say with OpenStreetMap, it's crowdsourced data, right? So it's relying on people, and it's not a lot of, I get often this question on the verification, who verifies it, and that's with open source or with crowdsourced data, it is the people, you have geo kind of geo validation, but in terms of the reliability, it's relying on people. Yes.
Maybe just picking up on that, you made a comparison to Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. So Wikipedia has those who will criticize it because anyone can edit it, add it, etc. But conversely, it's arguably the most reviewed, peer-reviewed source. So you've got two ways of looking at it. So I was wondering, do you have a similar thing from your mapping, that there's criticism because you're relying on people, so who is verifying what they do? Mm-hmm. Is there an overlay that because you've got so many inputs that you do get that balance?
Yeah, I think this is the question with any, we do, and when I say that, so like Humanitarian OpenStreetMap is an NGO that operates in that context, and the decision of the data generation is normally if you work with OpenStreetMap community in Kenya or others, so it's not like we as, of such with any platform, but you do have, so I think that's the power of it, that you get criticism, so the decision is not enforced by an organization of, you would use that, and you do have, similar to like Wikipedia, there are comments, if you add something and something has been updated, you can, you can comment or pull that information,
You share your training models with the bigger LLMs like ChatGPT, Cloud, etc. at all?
I mean, they're public, so they're on the. That's the thing that it's an open source. So when data is being scraped directly from the web, but it's so we use some standard kind of global that goes more into the mapping space of models. But they're all open and. Which is a big part of accessibility for the kind of communities we work with.
I'm interested in, obviously in a lot of humanitarian contexts, infrastructure is being impacted by the crisis or the conflict. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered if you had any examples of where the street mapping is open street mapping is happening. Mm-hmm. In the context of huge change to infrastructure and how that works?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, I very briefly whiz through mapping and what it means. Obviously in conflict, when we had this mapping and then you have the field one. So especially post-disaster and in conflict, a lot of the mapping is actually what we call remote. So it's not directly in the field because you can't, that's a simple no. So often in these situations, for instance, post-disasters or post-earthquakes, it's more looking at the satellite imagery and mapping directly from that, which is done remotely, as opposed to going in the field. And in other contexts, which is what we call maybe anticipatory action of related to like climate change. So with some of those, like a lot of different applications, not specifically like on AI, but having these considerations of like offline first, you know, if you're going into remote areas for mobile application that support mapping, that's another element.
How do you deal with fake information and the safeguarding aspect of it?
You mean fake information in terms of like the mapping being uploaded, or? So again, I would say this is the crowdsourced data. So you get information of the building, the information for the building, but there's no from us like a control of it besides looking at like the roads, the buildings, and that information. And it's in terms of safeguarding, I think was your question. If it is mapping within a local area, it's the communication with the organizations on the ground, like OpenStreetMap communities on the ground.
This might be a really basic question.
No.
I don't know much about mapping, but how does it actually work? So satellite imagery is pretty black and white, isn't it, in terms of a map? So I'm assuming mapping is different to how it used to be before that. So could you just give me an example of how you might put together a satellite image with then local information? Because they might have a different view about the layout.
What that is. I think with satellite imagery, so with satellite imageries, you have different, let's say, resolution, and how closely can you see if it's from that imagery, like can you actually see the buildings, like the trees, the roads, and so forth. So from that level, when you're looking at the satellite imagery, you're basically drawing from then on, okay, this is a square, this is a building. You upload that into OpenStreetMap, and once that's in an open database, like a public database, then the next step is adding information. Okay, this is a building. You can do that through a mobile application, for instance. But I think maybe your question was on if the satellite imagery, it's not always clear, and one of the big challenges with imagery is not often up to date. So you might have the latest imagery in an area from like 2020. They're big, like Bing, Esri, like different big providers, but you might not be able to see from that imagery what's actually on the ground. Does that answer your, No more silence.
We can go to our break, and unless there was anything else you wanted to add, say before you, because you have great time. Okay.
Yeah, amazing. I can do another presentation, or we can do hands-on, showcase you a bit of the, I think what I wanted to maybe, speak about is that it's not all generative AI, and just kind of thinking of applications of AI and focusing on the why, like why should we use this application. And there were a lot of references in the morning sessions around, you can say no, that doesn't apply in that specific context. So I think that's something quite core in terms of decisions of when to use an AI application or not. In this context, it's very much about, mapping and improving that process and making that more efficient. But there are lots of ifs in specific contexts where it's really important to make those considerations, and keeping people in the loop in that process, not just going in that direction without sense checking the local context.
I had a question, sorry.
Yeah.
I was wondering, people that have like visual impairments and stuff, how do they use this mapping system? How does AI contribute to that?
Say that again.
So I was wondering, people that have like visual impairments, how do they use that mapping system, and how does AI contribute to that?
That's a very good question. So I was,
Sorry.
that's it, no, that's it. I was trying to think of, I'm not sure. I think it's the already generated maps is maybe what you're thinking of. So I'm trying to think if there is an example, because a map is not always, a lot of the maps are different printed maps, but I'm trying to think if there are examples of maps that are generated with people from with visual impairment specifically. Yeah.
Okay, and for that.
Do you get any examples? Do you have any cases where, for example, a remote community does not want to be mapped?
Yeah.
Because obviously,
Yeah.
if you know your way around, I'm thinking about conflict where you don't want actually other people to know how to.
Yeah. I think an example was also in the war in Ukraine, because it's like what we do is having the technology to have like tools like the tasking manager that I mentioned, like splitting an area into tasks. So in that case, we weren't coordinating or supporting that, the generation of the map. So I think that was one example where we weren't creating project and supporting that, because that was a specific example. Yeah.
And I just wondered if you ever worked with other organisations that look at things like, for instance, you might have a group of young girls who are using a map to map whether they feel safe and not safe, and that used to be quite a lot in the plan applications. Like, have you ever collaborated with different organisations to do that, or could it be possible?
I was trying to think of young groups, but yeah, I was thinking more of youth in East Africa that was specifically mapping mental health centers, so like slightly different example to, I think, what you're asking. But there's so many examples that I probably wouldn't know them all, because I mentioned all my colleagues working in the regional context, and that's another case with open source and open data. The tools are there. You might not always know about the examples because they're free to use.
Just it gives a real opportunity to bring all of that information.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.